Verdi grieved over the death of Alessandro Manzoni, a leading Italian literary figure and friend to Verdi. He wrote this Requiem in part to honor Manzoni's memory. The Requiem met critical resistance from the moment it was performed. Hans von Bülow disparaged it as opera in ecclesiastic dress, and others denounced its cheapening of religion with theatrical contrivances. The Requiem clearly expressed Verdi's personal doubts regarding religion and prayer. Although severely moral, Verdi was anti-clerical and an agnostic. All throughout the Requiem, death plays a wide range of complex characters, sometimes a terrifying force, while other times the great emancipator. Overall, this reflects Verdi's appreciation of human drama, rather than the composed liturgical presentation or the academic theological examination. Because Verdi never intended his Requiem to be sung in a church service, he had much more freedom to compose sections that ran through the entire range of emotions, from happiness to fear, from majesty to reflection. As Verdi's normal style was operatic, he composed this Requiem to have soloists acting almost as characters, instead of singers within a massive choir. In this way, he allowed many of the parts, especially the soprano, to voice his own personal skepticism towards the Catholic religion. For instance, he wrote intense emotional music that often sounded at odds with a faith-based text.
Throughout the 7 movements of his Requiem, Verdi utilizes 4 soloists, a double chorus, and a massive orchestra to convey a wide array of dramatic emotions that encapsulate the complex nature of death. In the Introit and Kyrie, the soloists petition for eternal rest for the deceased, with a vocal theme that imitates crying, accompanied by soft violins. The sequence, Verdi's second movement, contains 10 separate sections that rely heavily upon trumpet calls, hammer strokes from the bass drum, and powerful vocal entreaties for salvation to express the horror and destruction associated with the fateful day of wrath and judgment. The third movement, the offertory, asks for deliverance of the faithful from hell using beautiful solo vocals and melodic string accompaniment that transform the tone from one of horror to one of salvation, light-filled and hopeful. The fourth movement, the Sanctus, divides the chorus into alternating melodies accompanied by lively string, brass, and woodwind instruments to generate a joyful mood and an atmosphere of celestial glory. The Agnus Dei, Verdi's fifth movement, sets 2 female soloists to a slow tempo and accompanies them with simple instrumentation to characterize the poignancy of their appeal to Christ to grant eternal life to the dead. The sixth movement, the Communion or Lux Eterna, reiterates the theme of seeking eternal rest for the deceased, which Verdi expresses once more by highlighting the pure, sincere voices of the soloists against simple woodwind and string accompaniment. However, an undercurrent of brass instrumentation darkens the sentiment. Verdi's Requiem concludes with the Liberame, which builds upon elements of Gregorian chant, vocal fugue, and a darkened version of the Dies Irae theme to dramatize the lone soprano's trembling plea for deliverance from the day of doom.
The huge emotional range of this piece, from the grandiosity of the Dies Irae to the terror of the Liberame, to the lyrical light-filled beauty of the offertory, make this Requiem the very antithesis of the humble Gregorian chant from which it is derived. Coming from the minimally religious Verdi, the piece thus functions more as a grand opera than as liturgical music. By dramatizing this funeral mass, replacing the somber reverence with hyper-operatic displays of emotion, it could be argued that Verdi fictionalizes the Catholic view of death. By moving the Mass from the church to the opera house, the Catholic death becomes a great story for the listener to admire, but perhaps not one for them to earnestly anticipate. The most iconic section of the Requiem is by far the Dies Irae. Verdi's Day of Wrath is more forceful and portentous than any other Requiem composer's. With 4 French horns, 8 trumpets, 3 trombones, tuba, timpani, bass drum, and hundreds of choral singers, Verdi achieves a sound that has more sheer force than the most dramatic of operas. Even his opera titled The Force of Destiny was not orchestrated for so many brass, much less such a volume of singers. Naturally, then, the sheer volume of the section is the first thing that strikes any listener. This magnitude, as well as the stark dynamic contrast with the whispered lines that follow, make this section impossible to be ignored. The motif that is repeated throughout the section begins with rhythmic, menacing accents in the orchestra, alternating with bass drum beats marked secco e molto forte, dry and very loud, followed by a huge crescendo in the chorus into a kind of musical chaos with the sopranos almost screaming a high G and mad swirling scales in the upper winds and strings. portrays musically the marching of a divine army and the disarray into which an unprepared humanity falls, the ascending and descending runs in the winds and strings representing the disparate fates of the blessed and the damned. This is followed by the brass blazoning that the day was foretold. After several repetitions as the rush of energy dissipates, the verse is reduced to a mournful echo of Dies Irae, which returns in key places throughout the rest of the piece, and finally the anxious sotto voce whispers of the trembling mankind before God.
The offertory is the only movement that features all four soloists in absence of the chorus, calling attention to the pure and profound beauty of the vocal performance. Domine Jesu Christe addresses the liturgical theme of appealing to God for deliverance from the depths of hell. Strings and woodwind instruments accompany the soloists as a means to enhance the expressive and melodious texture of the music. The mezzo-soprano and tenor call out to Christ longingly, invoking his name in a moment of polyphony. The bass enters on the word liberas to lead the mezzo and tenor in an impassioned plea for deliverance. This plea is enhanced by a dramatic vocal fugue in which the soloists' voices are deliberately offset to create a dark polyphonic texture expressing their ardent desire to escape the hellish terrors of death. Immediately following the soloist's completion of the first vocal fugue on the words in obscurum, Verdi generates a moment of intense vocal beauty by breaking the intricate pattern of melodies with a single mournful note sung by the soprano on the word sed. The haunting serenity of the soprano's entrance perfectly accentuates the soulful longing associated with Christ in the heavenly image of salvation. The confident crescendo of the soprano's voice, accompanied by a warm shimmer of strings and echoed by the other soloists, dispels the fear of death in a radiant sequence that evokes the sensation of springtime thawing the winter.
Requiems were critical parts of the Mass sung during Catholic burial rituals because they were thought of as a form of praying for the deceased. This was especially crucial because it was believed that if relatives and friends in this life prayed for someone who had died, it could have a significant impact on the amount of time the deceased were required to spend in purgatory. Thus, the act of praying was of incredible importance in the days following the death of a loved one. There are a couple of very solemn moments in Liberame in which the singer almost speaks the words instead of singing them. You can see how, on the score, all of the notes are played and sung in the exact same rhythm at the same time, which mirrors speaking or praying instead of singing. This gives a sense of reverent prayer within the song, highlighting the great significance of prayer within the Catholic burial ritual. Overall, the Liberame not only serves as a culmination of the entire work, but as its summation and emotional core, as if, having dutifully respected the traditional components of a Requiem Mass, Verdi at last steps out to have a final, deeply personal say. Verdi enhances the first portion of the Dies Irae outburst with a more intense orchestral role. Then darkens the texture and shifts emphasis from the universality of the chorus to the personal plea of the solo soprano. The text of Liberame clearly asks God to have mercy upon the deceased person at the last judgment. When thou shalt come to judge the world by fire, rest eternal grant unto them, O Lord. The text is written in first-person singular and is sung by a female soloist who is occasionally supported by a background chorus, who sings all in unison homophonically with quieter dynamics to add richer texture to the song. This implies that there is an entire community praying for their loved one who is passing into the afterlife. Verdi developed his Requiem in a different style than the solemn Gregorian chants. Verdi's use of loud dynamics and deep voices used in the prayer-like composition Liberame demonstrate Verdi's own fictionalization of the Requiem. The intensity and fervor of the song demonstrate Verdi's interpretation of a unique relationship with God that is less structured than in the traditional Catholic religion. It seems that Verdi, like Jesus, has humanized the relationship between mankind and deity concerning death, the one mystery of life that we all must confront regardless of social rank or religious outlook.